Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Matthew Laramie. I'm an enrolled member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, the Snipes Band, and I'm a Climate Resilience Regional Coordinator for the BIA branch of Tribal Climate Resilience. I want to do a quick plug before we jump in and just point out that we do have our TCR's annual funding opportunity that is open now through October 18th for climate resiliency funding. So please do go to our website. I'll put a link in the chat here in a moment for that. $120 million available this year in climate resiliency funding. And so related to that, but in general, we have a grant writing workshop today that we're very pleased to be helping to host. And this is being led by Dr. Meade Krosby and Dr. Chaz Jones. Sorry, Chaz. Meade Krosby is the senior scientist with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and the University Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And Dr. Jones is CEO and Director for PICEA Consulting Group. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to them for the beginning of the grant writing workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Matthew. Again, I'm Chaz Jones, and I work for PICEA Consulting Group, founded that, and recently was with the Affiliated Tribes Northwest Indians, where I was the Climate Resilience Program Director for the last few years, and worked for AT&I for 7 years. Meade?
Yeah, thanks, Chaz. So again, I work with Climate Impacts Group in Seattle, Washington, and also I'm the University Director for the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. In these roles, I apply for many, many grants and have for many years, from pretty small to, I guess, the latest one was as part of a $74 million award that was just made to the state of Washington that we're partners on, and everything in between. And I've also reviewed many grants. We actually are a funder at the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So review grants for that. And as part of other granting efforts, like I've reviewed for the National Science Foundation and other programs. So really excited to be able to, I'm trying to remember what year this is now that we've done this workshop. It's been at least 4 years. So excited to, again, have this opportunity to share some of the things that I've learned along the way, if it might be helpful to y'all. And we would love to see who all of you are. I see at least 1 or 2 familiar names, but many that I don't know. So if you all could please just enter your name and your affiliation and organization in the chat, so you all can see who's here and we can see who's here. That'd be great.
Excellent. Thank you, Meade. And yeah, so today we have a few objectives for today's webinar, and we want to familiarize everyone. This is really a grant writing 101 level webinar. We're not doing a 201 or a graduate level class. This is really just the introduction to grant writing. So we want to familiarize folks with the grant writing process, provide some resources so that you can identify climate-related funding opportunities. And we want to give some tips and some highlights to how our perspective on grant writing, and we want you all to build a shared learning community and know where you can go for assistance. So, next slide.
Yeah, and Chaz, did you put the link to the worksheet in the chat for folks?
Do it right now.
Thank you.
So, well, I'm going to wait until the introductions settle down a little bit before I do that.
Okay, smart.
It doesn't get buried. And so, yeah, we have this worksheet that we like to use so that you can walk through your process a little bit so that you can better define your proposal idea, define a funding strategy, identify who might be on your project team, and then identify funding opportunities for a particular project, decide whether or not it's a good fit, and then talk about how to frame your proposal and how to actually craft your story along a timeline. And we're going to help you define or illustrate how you can actually identify your timeline. So the worksheet that we provide will walk through those steps, and ultimately we want you to be a better, more effective grant writer, and then so you can actually submit your proposal in a good way and get more funding for your climate program. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to start us off with the first step in your grant writing journey, which is defining your project and building your team. What are you actually going to do and who are you going to do it with? So the first step of defining your project, what is it that you're going to try to get some money for? The first step is figuring out what the need is. What's the problem that your work is going to solve? What is the challenge that it's going to address? And this could be pretty general, like identifying or addressing climate risks to natural resources or cultural resources, or it could be more specific, like identifying or addressing risks to specific species or particular infrastructure. So often how you define that is, hopefully you're doing this proactively. We're kind of going to guide you in how to do this proactively rather than opportunistically. So how would you strategically think about the kind of work you want to fund and then go about getting it funded and identify needs? We do recognize, though, that sometimes this work happens opportunistically, where a grant opportunity comes out and then you define a need, of which you may have many in response to that call for proposals. And so to some degree, this may be larger or smaller depending on what you need, and to some degree it may be depending on the sponsor. And do they have a very specific ask, and your need is going to be defined in response to that. So this is somewhat flexible, but that's the first step. What is it that you're actually going to be addressing with this work? And then once you know what the need is, what the problem is that you're going to be addressing, you want to think about what your goals and objectives are in service of that need. What activities and tasks will you be doing to address those goals and objectives? So for this problem, what are you going to go about doing to solve the problem? And then what are the desired outcomes of the work? These can, again, be specific. These can be concrete products that you might be coming out with, like an adaptation plan, a hazard mitigation plan, but they could also be more intangible outcomes, like building capacity within your tribe for climate work, or outreach and engagement, or building a stronger network or community of practice to accomplish this work. So there may be both. You may have some pretty concrete outputs and outcomes, and then you may have some more intangible ones. So at this point, assuming introductions have calmed down in the chat, and I'm sorry, I'm running slides, so I can't see them right now. Chaz hopefully has shared with you a worksheet that we've put together to help you follow along with us. In reality, there's not going to be a ton of time to really get into the worksheet while you're here with us, but we want you to at least get started, jot a couple things down in notes, and then have this worksheet after the workshop to really fill it out in more detail. So Chaz, were you able to get that to folks, and are people able to access it and download it?
Yes, I shared it. I am hoping. I haven't seen anyone say they haven't been able to download it.
Okay, and we apologize. We know that some folks do have slower internet speeds where you are. Apologies, but we'll make sure you can get hold of it later if you can't get it right now. So just take just a few minutes to think, what is the need, even theoretically, if you don't have a specific proposal you're putting together right now, what is the need you want to address? What might be some goals and objectives around it and some desired outcomes? I'll just give a couple more minutes here while folks work on that.
We really did design this as a workshop, so it's a interactive a little bit hands-on, but so hopefully that's the outcome.
So you folks, just one more minute here, and we'll move on.
If folks are ready, feel free to give us the thumbs up and the reactions.
All right, that's 3 minutes. We know you're not gonna flesh all of this out in 3 minutes, but hopefully you at least got started, or at least mentally started thinking about what this might look like. All right. So you have defined your project. Next, you might want to think about developing a funding strategy. And again, we're offering kind of a proactive approach to grant writing here, recognizing that often this is opportunistic in response to opportunities. But let's think about how we might actually get a bigger scope of work funded that we want to do over time. So once you know what you want to accomplish, you can start thinking about a funding strategy aimed at paying for that work. And a really important thing to keep in mind is that we know the needs are huge, especially around climate change. The needs around adaptation, the needs around mitigation are enormous. So very often, all of this is not going to get funded at once, unfortunately. And so it might be helpful to think about addressing these big needs by dividing them into a series of fundable projects. You don't have to do it all at once. And these smaller projects can, over time, sequentially build into larger projects, much larger projects. And that can be particularly helpful if you don't have a funding track record in this area of work, if you haven't done climate-related projects before. And so funders may not be familiar with your work in this area. There might not be sort of demonstrable evidence that you can be successful in doing this kind of work. And so starting with smaller sequential projects and building to much larger projects can be a way to build that confidence in your team and your work over time. And funders may be willing to fund much larger projects over time as that evidence accumulates that you can successfully execute smaller projects and awards. And at the same time, you'll be building your capacity to do this work over time, your knowledge, your team. All of that work will accumulate over time and build to much larger projects. So just a suggestion to not have sort of an all or nothing approach to this, but to think about it strategically, modularly, building this work over time toward larger and larger projects. Next, you'll want to identify partners for doing this work. things like thinking about expertise. So do you have the necessary expertise within your team or within your tribe to do the work that you want to do to address the need that you want to address? If so, that's great. Can you pull that team together? If there's expertise that you need that you don't have in-house, can you identify or work within your networks to identify external partners that might be helpful to bring in to complement the expertise that you have with additional sets of expertise you might want for that work? So these could be adaptation or renewable energy organizations, other folks that may have some of that complementary expertise if you don't yet have it in-house. So pulling together the necessary expertise and thinking about, for those folks, if you do bring in, especially external partners, in evaluating external partners that you may want to bring on. And I know they're kind of coming out of the woodwork right now as more money becomes available for this work. So when evaluating who to bring on, if you do, in addition to looking at their expertise and their track record of doing this kind of work, and especially doing it with tribes, also thinking about their availability. Realistically, are they really going to have the time during the project period of that grant to work with you and get the work done? So evaluating their skill sets, their track record of doing this work, working with tribes, and their availability. Other things to consider, certain partners might be actually required to access certain pots of funding. Some pots are just for tribes. Some may be for institutions of higher education, for universities or colleges. Some might be for NGOs. Sometimes certain pots are just for particular kinds of partners or state or federal or whatever. And so that's helpful to think about if you see, first of all, if a funding call asks for a particular kind of partners to be involved, can you bring those on board? But then also sometimes it might not be for you. Maybe it's not intended towards tribes, but you could be a partner. And so maybe approaching, if they're trusted, approaching folks who are eligible for certain pots and seeing if they want to partner with you on this work, so that you have access to funding you wouldn't otherwise, because a tribe isn't identified as the kind of partner that they're funding. So being creative about thinking about how to get funds that maybe weren't intended for tribes in particular, but if you partner with somebody who is eligible, that opens up those funds for you. Also thinking about any necessary letters of support. These are often required for any partners on a team. And so making sure you see early on if those are required, and getting that on people's radars early, because it often you wind up kind of writing these for people, and it can take some work to get these letters of support. And so leaving yourself plenty of time and your partners plenty of time to get these written for a proposal. Okay, so you know what you want to do. You have a funding strategy for getting the work done. You have identified the partners you want to work on with you. Then you actually have to write the proposal, which could be a small lift, but is often a pretty heavy lift. And so things to think about: any tribal staff, obviously, that may be working with you on the project that you've identified as an internal partner, maybe folks who could help you write. Often you can break up the proposal into different sections that different people might have. Like admin, budget folks might be really helpful for working on those sections, and then people with particular expertise or in specific departments might be helpful for working on specific sections. So thinking about how to creatively kind of break up a proposal if possible, and delegating so it's not all landing in one lap if at all possible. If you are bringing on any consultants or contractors for that work, getting them involved early in the proposal writing, if at all possible. If you need support, if you need help with your proposal writing, there are tribal liaisons at various state and federal and other entities like the Climate Adaptation Science Centers who can provide, so it depends on the region and their capacity, but can often provide some support in preparing these. If your tribe has a grant coordinator, make sure to check in with them so that you're aware if anyone else at the tribe might be applying for the same pot of money, to make sure you're not competing with them if there is someone else, maybe you can collaborate with them and build a larger project with them. But just making sure that there's internal coordination going on. And also so that you don't eventually wind up in a difficult space if you apply for funding and nobody knows and then you get it. And then there can be some real hassles in getting those funds moved through the tribe after the fact. And then any other partners that need to be involved in that work, just making sure that any partners that are involved are considered in the grant writing team. Although eventually, so that it reads well, someone is going to have to take the lead and make sure that it doesn't, if you have many people involved, it actually reads smoothly all the way through. So someone will have to take that responsibility and make sure it reads like one product and not something that 20 people kind of threw together. And then again, your writers of letters of support are part of your team ultimately.
Thank you, Meade. And we're going to chat a little bit about grant writing consultants and how they can truly be an asset, but there's some challenges in working with grant writing consultants as well. But it's important to realize that consultants aren't as connected with you or your team or your priorities as you are. And so in hiring grant writing consultants, it's really important to, one, either hire folks that you know or folks that you trust, or you also need to be prepared to share with them your priorities, your goals. And as an external entity, it's not always super, communications, we all have problems with communications, getting someone to respond. And if you have difficulty replying to a consultant's emails or questions, you might have a hard time. They may just have a hard time working with the tribe or the department in actually achieving the goals that you're hoping for them to achieve. And I have seen numerous times when consultants do develop a product, but then the tribe or somebody, not necessarily the tribe, but someone never follows through with actually submitting it. So when working with a grant writing consultant, it's really important that you really consider it to be a partnership. They're working on your behalf. But even as tribal staff, you don't always have the luxury of being able to submit those grants on your own. And so it's important to develop a functional process that you can actually work with grant writers or consultants to actually get this work done. Yeah. Whatever the grant writers do end up writing, though, it's important to realize that you're ultimately responsible for doing the work. The tribe is responsible. So you really need to know what is written into those proposals. I've been hired to write these types of proposals, and oftentimes I'm able to write, a lot of leeway after hearing what the priorities are. And I write ideas, but then I really rely on my tribal partners to verify that what I had written is accurate, and I will highlight things, be like, I think this is true, but I don't really know. And it's really important that you can work with them to actually clean it up and make sure that what they do write is accurate and aligned with what your priorities are. Next slide. And next. But if you were to write proposals in-house, you are very familiar with your staff. You are very familiar with their capacity, with their skill sets, with their expertise. And so in some cases, it's better to write proposals in-house. That being said, sometimes if you want to write a proposal in-house, but you don't have the capacity, the grant is not going to be written, and you know that. So I've worked with some tribes that have just said, if I don't hire someone to do this, it's never going to be written. And so we just recently acquired a $20 million grant from the Community Change Grant for a tribal school. But it's really, that wouldn't have been written without them having some assistance. Next slide. Or next point. But it's really important to realize that developing proposal in-house can be a very large investment in time and resources. as can be as hiring a consultant. And getting grants or even having someone with lots of grant writing experience, writing a grant does not guarantee success. You should be expecting that the grants that you are writing will not be funded, at least these larger ones. But be really pleasantly surprised when they do, or be happy when they do. But there are no guarantees. This is the grant writing world. So next we have a poll. And I put in the chat a link to menti.com. So hopefully you have gone there and you can enter in this code 78909447 and answer this particular question. And in doing so, we will be able to see how many folks have been successful writing proposals in-house versus working in consultants, neither or both. And we're just gonna take a minute to see what the results are.
And I feel like I was remiss when talking about your grant writing team that I said the grant coordinator. I didn't say the grant writer necessarily, which might be two different people. Tribes, as you know, often do have grant writers, and that would be a very important person to get in touch with if they can help you with your proposal. And I saw that we have at least one grant writer on the call today, so.
Some have them on staff. Many tribes do not. And from what I've heard, many of them are also struggling to have capacity just to follow through with all these grants. I see some things coming in. Looks like we have some folks that have been successful. I'll give percentages here in a second. If anybody else wants to get in there and submit their poll. Right now we say that oops. Okay. They're actually answering they're answering the other poll, not to the other slide, not to. I'm sorry, folks. They're answering another question, Meade. And I don't know how or why that is.
Is it possible to send out in the chat the right poll number for this one and reboot it?
Same poll number, just going to a different slide. It's going to slide 2 instead of 1.
Oh, that's interesting.
There does appear to be a question from Andrew Burdett while we wait to sort that out.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Apologies, that was actually a mistake on clicking that hand raising. So, but I will say, nice to be with you all, and very excited to see the information coming forward for the Tribal Climate Resilience Program.
Ready? Thank you.
Oh, and I am a grant writer for my tribe and also an enrolled tribal member. So it's possible for your communities.
Yes, you can be successful. Definitely, lots of people have success, and I see now the polls are coming in,
and it's the right poll,
and it's the right one. We have a number of folks. Many folks is having success in-house. Even more working with both consultants and folks in-house. We have some that have only worked with consultants. So we have 8 Yeah, about equal numbers between in-house, both, and then we have some that haven't had success in either, and then some working with consultants. So thank you. Sorry about the technical glitch there. I'm happy that it's working.
One thing I might note, and maybe this is obvious, but that can change over time too. And so part of the thing about grant writing is it's a really important capacity building opportunity around the thing you want to work on. And it's hard to know how to write a good grant if you haven't before. And so it might be that maybe that first one or the first couple you work with a consultant, but that's a capacity building opportunity. And then eventually you have that capacity to do it in-house. And so these may change over time as you get more experience writing these kinds of grants.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. So let's have folks take a minute then with your worksheet to think about who you might include in your grant writing team, given where you are now with the capacity you have, both in terms of time and expertise. If you have a grant writer in-house, if you don't. So just take 3 minutes and start filling out your worksheet on that grant writing team. Okay, I think we're about at 3 minutes there. Hopefully folks got a start on that. Oh, Raina, did you come late and not get your worksheet? Chaz, oh, there you go. You shared it. Okay, beat me to it. So hopefully everyone has the worksheet now. Sorry if anyone joined late and missed that. We know you're not going to, for those who joined late, we know you're not going to be able to fill out this whole worksheet on this call, but it's there to help you start thinking about some of these questions and get a start on it, and then you can finish it up later. All right, Chaz, you want to take it away with funding opportunities? Oh, you're muted.
Absolutely. So there are many funding opportunities available throughout the year, and particularly this year. And we're going to just give a few ideas for how you may find a few opportunities. Next slide. And many of these opportunities exist because agencies or nonprofits or foundations, other entities, they have a priority that they have goals and objectives they want to achieve, but they cannot do that on their own. They have pots of money that are intended for certain purposes. And by giving it away to people who are pursuing those goals and objectives, you're helping them to achieve not only your goals, but you're also helping them to achieve their goals. And so in serving tribes and delivering funding to them, you're helping them to achieve their goals. The BIA, so there's a bunch of different potential funding opportunities. One of them, highlighted in this particular workshop, this online workshop, is the BIA Tribal Resilience Program, who is hosting this workshop and who has a big funding opportunity available right now. Grants.gov is a very comprehensive funding opportunity or funding database from the federal government, but it can be really intimidating to go through and challenging to identify the funding opportunities that are appropriate for the multitude of things that are your priorities. Various state agencies have funding available, and you would need to be able to identify those through newsletters or some of their email database or their listservs. Many nonprofits have funding available. It can be hard to find them all. But one opportunity that exists for folks is the University of Oregon's Tribal Climate Change Guide, which I have a link here too, and we will discuss here a little bit in more detail. Kathy Lynn hosts the Tribal Climate Change Guide at the University of Oregon, and it's a great curated list of opportunities that are specifically related to climate or some of its closely related opportunities. In addition, there are many newsletters available, some of which are from the Regional Climate Adaptation Science Centers. The Affiliated Tribes Northwest Indians Climate Change Program has a newsletter available. You can sign up at that link. There are many listservs available and all the different private foundations. But next slide. We're going to talk to you a little bit about this Tribal Climate Change Guide, which I'm a huge fan of. I mean, Kathy Lynn's a great partner of ours. So if you go to this website, and we are not going to do it on this webinar, but if you go to it, and we're going to give you an opportunity to do it on your own in a second, and you can do a keyword search for a topic area like trees or energy or climate. It will bring up a various list of opportunities. It will share with you the states that it might be relevant, the total dollar amount, and the deadlines. And so we're going to ask you to go ahead and spend a few minutes and go to the Tribal Climate Change Guide and try to find an opportunity, a funding opportunity that may be available for the particular project that you are working on in your worksheet right now. So go ahead and go to the website and do a search and see if you can find an opportunity that is appropriate for your project. We'll give you about 5 minutes. And I know I didn't give you 5 minutes, but I am going to cut it a little bit short just so that we can spend a little bit more time on some tips and tricks of grant writing. Can you go to the next slide? I'm just going to highlight 3 opportunities that I found that I just thought I would highlight for you. And the Arbor Day Foundation has funding available for trees and urban tree programs. And I believe it was up to $1 million, if I remember, for trees on tribal lands. So if you want, you can go into that database and go back and find that if you're interested. Deadline is September 30th. It's a pretty easy application process. Next, again, the BIA Tribal Resilience Program funding that brings us all together today. Deadline is October 18th, actually. That slide is slightly outdated, but October 18th. And it's a great funding opportunity to do climate resilience planning and implementation. I think there's 4 million, you can get to $4 million for implementation projects or 250,000 for planning projects. And then I believe there's also some workforce capacity building opportunities as well. And yeah, I highly encourage you to consider applying for those funds. And then lastly, the EPA Community Change Grants. Final deadline is November 21st. However, they've been accepting applications since November of last year on a rolling basis. And they're up to $20 million for tribes. And they have 2 different pots of money. Some are smaller, some are larger, but they're encouraging folks to submit sooner than later in anticipation of changes that may occur in the near future. So next slide. And Meade, I'll let you take this.
Thanks, Chaz. Okay. You've looked at a bunch of funding opportunities, or a funding opportunity has come across your desk, someone sends it to you, and then you need to decide, am I actually going to apply for this? So some things to consider in deciding whether to apply. First is fit. Is this actually a good fit for the work that you want to get done or you could get done? So the first would be your project idea. Is the thing that you actually want to do a good fit for what they're looking for in a project. And there are a lot of different ways to frame any given project idea, but there's certain limits to what you can really make seem like a good fit for a project. So thinking carefully about, is this really going to fly? Is this really what they're looking for before you even go down the road? Is your tribe or your tribal organization a good fit? Do they fund tribes? Do they fund tribal organizations? And again, you can, if they don't, you could think about partnering with an eligible organization, but it is important to first make sure you're actually eligible to apply. And if not, then see if it's even possible to find a partner to go in on it with you who is eligible. Is it worth the effort to apply? This is a really important question. How much competition is there going to be for this? If the funding rate is extremely low, if your chances of getting it are extremely low, that's really a different equation than if it's a high funding rate and you're likely to succeed. So thinking carefully about, is this something that thousands of people are going to be applied for and is a very low funding rate, or is this a regional local competition where there, for example, where there may be far fewer applicants? And how much effort to apply? Is this a pretty short, 3-page proposal, or is this going to be like 100-pager or 200 with accompanying documents? Some of these can be really heavy lifts to apply and may have match requirements and other things that you'll want to consider. Can you bring everything you need to bring to the table to apply? And do you have the capacity for the lift? And then all of these have to be compared to the value. So if it's a very low funding rate and very little money, and it's a huge effort to apply, that's a pretty bad proposition versus something that might be very competitive, might be a heavy lift, but has a huge return if you do get it. If these are multi-million-dollar, really game-changing grants, it might be worth the effort then to go for it, even if it's a low probability of success and a heavy lift. Sometimes we just take those risks because the reward might be like really game-changing for your community. So all of that is really kind of this like cost benefit analysis of whether it's worth it to go in on this grant at this time. And are you actually able to apply? So are there internal tribal policies that would prevent you from applying, or are approvals needed? And I do get the sense that this is getting better as funders are getting better educated about this, but one of the most frustrating situation is when there's an extremely short turnaround on a proposal. The proposal window is shorter than the time needed for a tribe to actually, for example, if it has to go in front of council to get approval to put a proposal in, and that might take 30 days, and the proposal's due in 30 days. That's a really unfortunate situation. I do feel like that's starting to get better, but something to consider. Can you get the approval you need to put the proposal in? Are there any internal policies that you have to navigate to make that happen? And then finally asking, seriously, are you in the tribe ready to apply and do the work for this particular opportunity? So if you're going to put the effort to go in for it, just being real sure that this is something that you all are ready to do if that money comes through. Okay. So thinking about that question of fit, and then if you had a chance to even glance at those funding opportunities on the Tribal Climate Change Project page or the 3 opportunities that Chaz highlighted a minute ago, just take a couple minutes to quickly jot down on your worksheet any of these opportunities that might look promising, and whether they seem like a good fit for your project and your tribe and your team right now. So just a couple minutes. Okay. Hopefully our second poll, the questions will align with what's in the poll. But we do have one more question for you in the poll, which is, have you had success identifying climate-related funding sources? Have you successfully competed for climate-related funding sources, or not yet? This is a work in progress for you. And please feel free to suggest great funding sources or any lessons learned in the chat box. And I think that, oh, there we go.
Looks like we have about an even number of folks across all three of these categories. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into the next slide.
So was it even across them, Chaz?
Yep, about 30. There's like 30 or 29 and 31 and 28%.
All right, so a lot of folks, that is a good chunk if 30% of folks on here have had success. So use that chat box if you have any lessons learned for folks along the way. And I'll pass off to Chaz to get us started on actually crafting and submitting your proposal.
I believe some people are still trying to answer the question. I believe it's active, but so in crafting your proposal, well, we have a number of slides here that we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think that that's the majority of the reason why most of you come to the talk. You really wanted to hear tips on how to craft your proposal and really respond to the particular opportunities. We thought it was important that you be able to identify the specific RFPs first, so that therefore you can have something to refer to. So next, so the most important thing in terms of developing your proposal is that you follow the instructions. You know, there's so many applicants for people or for these funding opportunities, and there's a lot of great project ideas. There's a lot of projects out there that are just great. And unfortunately, there's not enough funding. And so funders need to whittle down the project ideas into projects that they are able to fund. And one reason that it's very easy to exclude a project simply because you didn't follow the instructions in the application. If you don't submit by the deadline, it's an easy way to just say, no, we're not going to fund them. Or if you wrote in too small of a font and they told you specific details about that, it's really easy to say, no, we're not going to fund them. Or you came in and you didn't have any external partners, or you didn't have the right staff, or you're not talking about the same priority topic area. It's really easy to just say, no, we're not going to fund them. You can go to the next two bullets. So in terms of following instructions, you need to really make sure that you provide everything that's requested. If they need your indirect cost rate agreement, then you need to make sure that you include that. One way that I use to ensure that I am including everything that's requested is that I use the PDF and either convert that to a Word document, or I copy and paste all of the language in the PDF or the NOFO or the RFP, whatever term you prefer to use or that's being used. I copy and paste that into a Word document, including the headings, so that I make sure that I am using the exact headings that the funder is using. And then I have easily accessible the definition of what they want to have included in those sections. So I create an outline using the RFP as a template. And then I make sure that I frame, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but I make sure that I frame the project specifically around the programmatic needs that are specified in the RFP. Can you just go to the next slide? So, for instance, there are many ways to describe a particular project, many different ways to frame a project. And so you may be really interested in soil health, but you identified an RFP that is really focused on carbon sequestration. Well, you can very easily discuss soil health in terms of carbon sequestration. And so what I like to do is I challenge all of my staff or people who I'm working with, partners, to really reframe the conversation from what's in the terms and priorities that I think about when I think about my project, and reframe that in terms of the terms and priorities that are used by the funder. And you can do that. And here I give several examples of different opportunities to do that. One of the things that I do, another tip that I do when I'm looking at an RFP, is I go through that RFP with a highlighter, whether digital or on paper, and I highlight the key words. And those keywords, the type of terminology that the funder is using, I make sure that I mirror that language in my proposal. And so I would highlight, in this case, I would highlight carbon sequestration. And I would go through the entire RFP, highlighting language that I want to make sure that I use and mirror in the proposal. And so that's just a quick little tip that I would use in doing that. And we can go into more detail on those things, but let's go to the next slide. In terms of budget, when I am writing a proposal, first thing I need to do is I need to, one, sell the idea of me writing this grant to my supervisor or to the tribe if needed. And so you have to have like a 1 to 2 sentence, summary of what you're going to do. And that's where you can kind of frame that conversation, but you really want to frame it to their priorities. The next thing I really do is I develop my budget. And by designing my budget, it helps me to think through the different aspects of the project. It helps me to think about the different phases of my particular project and the project approach that I'm going to use to get the work done. And it also ensures that I have a check on the level of effort and the magnitude of the project that I'm considering versus that which the funder is willing to fund. So I use the budget as a tool to help me prepare to write the project narrative in a more detailed way. But when designing your budget, it's important that you ask for sufficient amount of funding to do the work that you're wanting to do. And recognize that smaller funding requests are typically easier to fund, but there are sometimes minimums and there's always maximums. But you don't want to ask for more than you can spend. So even if the maximum is $20 million, but you have an $8 million project, you don't want to ask for the $20 million if you're not able to spend it. That reflects poorly on you, the program manager, on the tribe, and it's just bad practice. So ask for what the project will actually cost, unless you have match and you're going to add match to it, or you have partners that are going to match. But make sure that you have access to all the funds that you need to complete the work, and Be willing to ask for less if you don't need as much, and you probably it'll be more easier to fund your project if so. There are some very, very simple budgets, such as the one that I show here. But yet there are some very, very complicated budgets that are many pages of a spreadsheet. And so just be prepared. When you're developing a budget, depending on the level or the type of project and the funder, you may be asked to develop a very complex budget, or it could be a very simple budget. Next slide. Another thing that I like to do after developing the budget is I think about the project timeline. And typically I do not jump straight into developing a Gantt chart, but often I just write in a Word document the different steps that I'm envisioning for the project. And then I identify dates. I have identified dates for each of those phases of the project, or each of those tasks. And ultimately, I could use a tool to develop a Gantt chart or some sort of other graphic. Gantt charts can be created in many special programs, but you can also use Excel. And someone in the chat's talking about indirect costs being applied to direct costs. And there's lots of rules around indirect costs. I will mention that the BIA Tribal Resilience Program Fund grants this year, I believe that they're not asking you to include indirect costs in your budget. They will pay that separately and allocate those funds separately. So that's a great thing for this next deadline. Meade, can you go to the next slide? And I think that we'll let you take this one.
Okay. So now you can use your worksheet and take just a couple minutes to quickly write down whether you think you could fund your project with a single grant or several, and what kind of timeline you expect will be required. So thinking about the scope of the project and your budget and your timeline. Okay, hope you had enough time to at least start jot down some thoughts on a budget for the kind of work you want to do and how long that might take, and whether that might require several proposals versus one large proposal. We bring it home here in the last stretch. We're going to talk about what's in a compelling proposal. Now you're writing your proposal. I think one of the most important things to remember is that ultimately a good proposal is going to be telling a story. You are telling a story that ultimately you hope is pretty persuasive, that is going to convince the reviewers that this is something that they would pay for out of their pocket. Like, you want a really hyped up reviewer for your project. So there is a bit of a formula for how this story goes. Usually we start the story with the problem. We're describing the problem that our work is going to solve, or at least attempt to make a dent in. So you're starting usually pretty big with this big problem. And then you're going to kind of winnow into the specific part of the problem that you're going to be solving. And you want to give the reviewer some confidence that this is actually a pretty important problem. And so you might say something about previous work that's been done to try to address this, or some history of this problem, so that you can make it clear where the gap is, that there actually is a gap. There's a need. So here's this really important thing. This is a real problem. This is a real challenge. Either there hasn't been any ability to really get anything done on this, or people have tried, but there's this thing remaining. Like, we still have this thing that has to get done. That's the essence of the thing that you want to get money for, is this filling that gap. So you then want to describe your potential solution to this need. What are you going to do to fill the gap in this really important problem? And then you're going to tell us about how you're going to do this work. How are you going to address this challenge specifically, generally, and then very specifically what tasks? And some of this will depend on how much space you have, but to get into how much detail you're allowed to go into, but you do need to tell us how you're going to solve this problem. There has to be some way of convincing the reviewer that you're the one to do this work, that you actually have the capacity to do it, you have the necessary expertise, that you can actually get this work done. Usually somewhere in there, they want to know how you'll even know that you're successful. So if you get this money and you do this work, how will you know that you've succeeded? And so there might be something in there about evaluation, metrics, some way for them to know that when you report back, you'll know when you've succeeded, and you'll be able to demonstrate to the funder that you've succeeded. And then ultimately, what's going to be the broader impact of this work? How will this improve things for your community, for the broader public, whatever it is that the funder cares about? How are you going to demonstrate that this has made a difference, that this work will have made a difference? And so this is kind of the arc of a proposal. And again, a lot of this is going to depend on the specific format of this specific proposal, but generally speaking, that narrative, that ability to tell the story of this thing in terms of, here's the problem, here's what's missing, here's how I'm going to solve it, this is why I should be the one to do it, here's how we'll know that we succeeded, and this is why this will help change the world. Like, that's kind of the arc of any good proposal. They're reading a lot of these things, the reviewers. So that story needs to be really clear to them, so they know what the argument is and why they should care. And so to strengthen that story, to strengthen that proposal, first of all, any opportunity to back up what you're proposing to do with what you've already done, that helps them know that you're going to succeed. So again, any evidence that your team has the capacity to do this, that there's been effort up to this point, that's going to be really helpful. That's where this sort of sequential project thing becomes handy, that if you haven't done anything like this before, maybe starting with a smaller project and working up to this, so that eventually you can tell that story in a much larger grant. But they'll usually ask for some evidence of how you're going to, of some evidence that you can do this work, but anywhere that you can sneak it in there too is really helpful. And then making certain that your project is described as being achievable and that it actually is. I think anybody, especially when you apply for a large grant, there's always the moment of, yay, we got the grant. Oh God, we got the grant. Like you actually have to do the work, right? And so make sure that you really can do the work, which is another reason sometimes starting small is better so that you build the capacity, your team builds the capacity to actually do the work. So when you get the bigger ones, you're really ready to do it. Again, Chaz talked about this earlier, but really mirror that language and style in the RFP. I do the exact same thing when I have a grant proposal. I copy and paste all of the headings into a Google Doc if I'm working with a team or a Word doc. I use the exact same headers and subheaders and major headers that they provide, use exact same language and structure. The reviewers will be expecting that. I take the instructions for each section and I paste it as a comment for each header. So I never forget the entire time I'm writing the proposal, this is what they asked for in this header. And really sticking to that language and that style because it means that they will feel seen and that like you will be actually addressing what they asked for because you're using similar language and you're holding yourself to that. And they'll see themselves in that proposal, like, yes, they're really addressing this thing that we were hoping to see. So again, really use that RFP and highlight its checklist, like anything you need to do to make sure that you've addressed everything in there and use their language. And show enthusiasm. You really are kind of selling this thing to them, not in a disingenuous way. Again, like you're often, especially for foundations, like you are helping them meet their mission by doing this work. And so not in a disingenuous way, but any passion, enthusiasm of a good project comes through when you're enthusiastic about it. And so just recognizing this is an effort in persuasion, again, not in a disingenuous way, but crafting a really clear story and argument really assertively throughout all of this is really helpful. And above all, making sure it's readable. You want to make it really easy for the reviewers to read this. Very, very clear and concise language, having multiple eyes on it to read it through and make sure it makes sense, not just to you, but to other folks on your team. Get a fresh set of eyes, especially towards the end. Does this thing read clearly? Again, they're reading so many proposals usually, and just want to make it as easy for them as possible. Highlight key points. If there are usually places in a grant, often one big one in the introduction when you have the thing, like this is the thing we're doing, like our sort of project statement. It might be several places in a grant. I will use bold, I will underline a sentence when it really captures the thing that I'm trying to do in that work. So anywhere that you have a really important, it's very often like the last sentence of the first paragraph of a major section or something like that. It's like, this is the thing we're doing. Highlight that thing, underline it, make sure it pops off the page so that the reviewer is scanning through, they know what you're doing. And then use figures if you're allowed to, and if there's space for it, to illustrate complex concepts. So this could be, this is just a real simple example of like a climate adaptation figure, where you might sort of talk about your process that you're going to be doing, or like what stages of adaptation you're doing or something like that. But it can also be if you have a bunch of partners and there's a bunch of workshops and there's like, different stages of review, you can do a figure that shows like sort of a schematic of your project. Like, here's workshop 1 and here's what we're doing and this is the date. And then like, here's workshop 2 and then here are the partners and how those all work. Or if it's infrastructure or whatever, you can have conceptual figures that describe in a different way from narrative text what you're doing that might help the reviewer understand. And when those figures are nice and all of this, and it kind of all builds, you're trying to demonstrate competence in the proposal itself. So when the language is clear, when you followed instructions, you've told a good story, when you have a couple nice figures that make it easier for the reviewer, all of that demonstrates to them this person, and you get it in on time, all of that stuff. It's like, oh, they're going to follow through. They're going to do a good job because they're showing me how they do a good job in the grant. Usually they'll ask for some kind of executive summary. There's often pretty clear instructions for that. But one thing I would suggest is always write that last, because it's really supposed to distill your whole project. And you can't really do that until you've written the whole thing, because proposals crystallize ideas, right? In the process of writing the proposal, you will crystallize what it is that you thought you were going to do and then what you're actually going to do. And it will change as you're writing, as you become aware of, like, oh, well, that's going to be really challenging. Maybe we don't do that. Let's add this. So do that executive summary last and save yourself time so you don't have to rewrite it when ideas change. Chaz, you want to talk about some additional resources for folks?
Absolutely. So this is a lot. Writing a grant can be a lot of work. And sometimes it's just nice to have some support and folks to go to if you have questions. And the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, also known as CASCs, the USGS CASCs have tribal liaisons in each region. And here we identify each of the tribal liaisons for the various regions. And you should feel free to reach out to them to ask for support of whatever type you may need, to see if they may be able to help you, whether finding the right team, helping with the budget. In some cases, they may be able to review your proposal, your draft proposals. Next slide. And another opportunity, and I will put a link in the chat, but another opportunity for technical assistance on grant writing, and I put a link in the chat there, is in using the EPA's Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers. And they are specifically funded to assist tribes with, and other communities with, developing grant proposals. So in some cases, you may find that they can be very helpful. And they're segregated by region, or also there's some that provide national effort. And so please click on that link, and you can find the contacts for your particular region. Otherwise, Meade, you can go to the next slide. And yeah, Raina, I see your comment, and you can always reach out to us, myself or Meade, for additional follow-up as well.
Okay, so thanks for hanging with us through the end. In summary, and it was nice to see people offering this in the chat. Actually, those some of the grant writers that we have on the call today were noting, basically, writing a good grant it's a skill and it can be learned, and you absolutely will get better at this over time. If you ever have an opportunity to be a grant reviewer for any kind of proposal, it is very challenging. It does take time, and it is priceless. There is no better way to learn how to write a grant than to review grants. Or if you have examples of successful grants within your tribe, even for totally different programs, see if somebody will share a successful grant with you. Because again, it's priceless to see other examples of successful grants. And there's all kinds of tricks that people have that you just wouldn't figure out on your own. You'll have your own tricks, but seeing what other people do, it is so helpful. So you can learn, you can get better, and you do not have to go it alone. So ask for help. We offered a couple different opportunities with the Tic Tacs and the CASTs, so more acronyms. But reach out to those Tic Tacs and the CASTs and folks in your tribe and your department or other departments, or if you have a grant writer, and ask for help. Don't try to do this alone, and especially if you haven't before. And then remember that you ultimately don't have to fund your project all at once. It is worth considering a longer term funding strategy so that you can start small and build up to those really big projects. And I know right now there is a lot of money moving around. There are a lot of really large grants available. So that's challenging if you haven't done one of those before. Partnering is always a nice way to see how these big grants get done if you haven't done one before, and you can find another tribe or organization to partner with on one of these big grants, that might make it more feasible. Because I know, again, it's opportunistic often, and right now there's a lot of money moving. So start small. If you want to go big, find some partners to go in on with you. And finally, make sure that you're thinking about crafting a compelling story. And one that's achievable. But this is an effort or an exercise in persuasion, and you need to have a narrative that is really carrying the reviewer along with you so that they care. Ultimately, you want them to have the feeling like, I would pay for this thing if I could. Like, people get hyped and they champion grants that they want to see funded, the reviewers do. So really tell that story, and nobody knows your tribe better than you. Nobody knows what matters to your community better than you. And so really lean into that. Why does this work matter for your community? Why is this important? And just really tell it from that perspective. And we do have, that's all we have. So we do have a brief evaluation for you all. These are really helpful so that we can know how to improve these when we do these. Chaz will provide a link in the chat. And thank you all so much for attending today. We hope this has been helpful. I know that we have a wide spectrum of experience and expertise in the audience with folks who've done a lot of these and folks who are just beginning. So hopefully there's a little bit of something for everybody here. And we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Meade and Chaz. We really appreciate the presentation, and I hope that was, useful for everybody here. As they mentioned, if there are any questions, please reach out, to myself or to Meade or Chaz, and let us know. You can reach out to me if there's stuff specific to TCR's funding opportunity. We have myself and 6 other regional coordinators across the country who are available to help and offer technical assistance for that funding opportunity. And great idea to reach out whichever funding opportunity and see if there's technical assistance provided. So yes, thank you everybody. And we do hope to make a recording of this available on TCR's website. I put a link there in the chat for where that'll end up. So thanks everybody. Take care.
Thanks everyone.